Okay, welcome. This is the Wild Dog collar setup. In this video, we're going to open up the collar and switch on all the devices ready for calibration and deployment thereafter. So let's get straight into it. We have a prototype here, which will be very similar to the collar you have. I think there's some differences where you have metal plating along the side for extra security and protection. There might be one or two slight differences, especially with the top housing, and these ones have been a bit battered as they've been tested, but the fundamentals should be the same, and this video should still be really clear on how to set up your Wild Dog daily diary logger. So let's get straight into it. The first thing we can do is we can test the VHF to see if it's logging, and we'll need this magnet later on as well. So you need to keep the magnet, and you can either keep the tape, or you'll have to rewrap the tape because you'll want to switch off the VHF later. So we take the magnet off. We then take our VHF receiver and now the magnet's off, we can use the VHF frequency given on the inside of the collar to see if our VHF's working. Perfect. So it was actually two thousandths of a megahertz frequency out, but yes, the VHF is working within the collar. We can leave that VHF running while we do the rest of the setup, it's not a problem, and then attach the magnet at the end. So let's switch on the daily diary, the bottom part. The first thing we need to do is take our Allen key. So I'm pretty sure this is a 2.5mm Allen key you need for here. I have two instruments, both do the same thing. I might use a combination of them both. And this is the important piece of equipment you'll need to open up your daily diaries, and it's the one thing I didn't supply. So just unscrew here, it might be better off to use this. Yep. We're just taking off the side with the lid. Do not touch the other side, that should be really firmly fixed onto the collar, whereas the side you're supposed to take off should be sitting a bit looser, where you can see the screws. Where this is the prototype, the bolts are slightly worn. Okay, that's off. So you want to take off the side of the collar that's going to reveal this lid. Once again, don't take off the other side, that's secured firmly, and it has also the section where the VHF is put to run up the cable, so it'll be a real big hassle if you get the wrong side. So make sure you get off the side with the lid. In this case, it's the left-hand side, if we assume this is going to be the front-facing panel. I'm just going to grab a screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, to pop open the lid like a tin of paint. There should be a divot on the underneath where you can lodge something in. Rotate the screwdriver and the lid should pop off to reveal the battery and daily diary. Okay, now down to the serious part, the more tricky part, because once the daily diary is powered up, it's going to take some time to reprogram and reformat everything involved in this. So getting this right is really important. What we're going to do is I'm going to show you an example of how to plug in with a logger and separate battery, and then apply that to in-housing. So what you want to do is you not only want the red and the black cables to match up, but you want to make sure you take this white box on the top of the male plug attached to the battery so that it sits or clips in to the female plug, like so. And what will happen is that the tag should light up as it switches on. See the little light? Now this doesn't have a memory card, and if the memory card's loose, your device will do the same thing, where it will flash yellow or orange. You should see it quite clear in the housing, because it should light up the whole ABS plastic housing. Okay, so remember the white box fits in the white hole for the male and female end, and another good indication is the black slides in with the black and the red slides in with the red. You do not want to get that mixed up the other way, because if you force it enough, it will actually slot in the other way. That's no good. It should make sense to you when you see it, but it's really good to be nice and clear so you get it right. When the daily diary is plugged in and you get that flash show, or you're happy the data is recording, so when switching on your daily diary device and you're happy it's logging data, it's always good to record a switch on time. It can be useful after the data's been collected, so it doesn't have to be to the second, just a general time. I'm going to record that time. Now let's do that inside the housing. I'm going to try and do this so you can see it best with the camera. So we take this battery plug and we're going to use a non-metallic object. I've got a toothpick here just to fish out the female plug of the daily diary, because I don't want to move the daily diary. I want to keep it fixated in its spot. Can I hold it best I can? It might be easier for you because you can rest it on the table. But bring over the plug, my white box being filled in by the white square. Do you see a little light show inside? That means it's powered up and we're good to go. Now, we want to make sure this is logging, because if it's logging, we can then seal the capsule, or we know we're collecting data. I don't know if you can see in the light now, but there's a faint green dash on the light closest to you. To make it easier, I'm just going to go and grab the lights. Can you see that? I think you can. See that green light? That means we're in business. We're collecting data. No need to move the battery, no need to move the daily diary. All we need to do now, although this part is important in its own right, is move the wires so they won't get caught in the lid. So one of the concerns is when the lid gets knocked in and then glued, it will nip one of the wires, and if it nips one of the wires, it could cut it, weaken it, and therefore stop collecting data, stop powering the daily diary. So what we're going to do is I've left lots of nice space in the cavity for you to tuck your plug and wires away. So I'm just going to play around with it with my fingers, try and not put any metallic objects in there, just so that it's definitely clear. So I've pushed the plug down here where it's connected, knocked it down there, and I'm making sure my wires run through this gap here over the top of the circuit board, and make sure it doesn't get in the way. See how it's trying to sit up on the top there? I don't want that. Let's get it down. There we go. Lovely. Make sure it doesn't try and sit up by itself. Okay. Good to go. Now we can apply the lid. So depending on your deployment strategy, you might not glue them in. You could just pop the lid on, and then glue at a later date. But for now, I'm just going to imply that we're using glue and gluing them in straight away. So to use the glue, I think I've supplied some Loctite or some Gorilla Glue. It's really horrible stuff, so try and not get it on your fingers. Really evil stuff. It's going to react slightly with the ABS plastic to give it a proper good firm hold. So what you want to do is, this is purely for display purposes, and no glue is going to come out. You want the area completely covered, a good amount, but make sure not excessive amounts of dribbling all over the equipment. It shouldn't affect the equipment, but if we can avoid any sort of issues with regards to the glue mixing, then if they can be avoided, great. Once you've used the glue, pop the lid on or rest it in place. This one, I think they have a particular way of fitting on. So this, for example, this didn't like being sat this way around, but if I turn it around, so you might want to wear gloves for this. I'm not using the actual glue, but when you're doing it, you might want to use gloves. We rest her in place, try to pop her in with our hands, but to ensure there is no gaps. But to ensure there's no gaps, I'm just gonna grab this mallet or a hammer. Just be really careful and just lightly knock her in. There we go. Some excessive glue might burst out the sides, but that's okay. You can wipe it down or just leave it to harden. And just make sure there's not too much gap in between. There's quite a big gap here in this prototype, but it should be a nice, tight, close fit for the loggers that you have. Okay, so that's the daily diary all set up. Let's move on to the GPS. So we're going to take the GPS unit off the top. Using the same Allen keys, there we go. For this, you'll need a pair of pliers I have here, and you just want to pull out the bottom from the top. Now, with the devices you have, that's going to be a much tighter fit. That's going to be a bit of a struggle to pull out, so be careful with it. Take your time. Try a seesaw action where you pull from one side to the next, to the middle, and eventually it should come out. Here's the battery and GPS unit, and once again we want to plug and tuck. So it's the same plug as the daily diary. I'm just using the toothpick to get it out, and then I'm going to plug together. It might be worth noting here that this has been completely built with me in the workshop, so the wires, although very functional and have been customized completely, they're not overly strong. They'll last once they're in the housings and they'll be completely safe, but when we're handling them, they can be quite brittle. So just be careful not to pull or tug too hard onto the cables, because they might break, and if they break, they will need to be sent back to me because resoldering isn't really an option. Once it's plugged in, you won't get any lights because these GPS units are triggered off by a magnet. But what you can do is, we're going to see if it's working and it hasn't got damaged in transit. So we're going to take that magnet you took, which was preventing the VHF from logging, and just run it over the GPS, and it should start to try and search for satellites with a little flash show. Great. Now we want to conserve as much battery life as possible, so we're going to actually activate that through the housing during the deployment phase, but for the setup phase we want it switched off. So run the magnet over again and it should switch off. Great. We're going to then tuck the wires in best we can. So the way I see it is there's a nice cavity or space between the battery and the GPS here. So I'm just going to try and put her in. I think that's okay. Make sure these wires aren't resting on the edge, because if they're resting on the edge, they're going to get caught by the housing. And then we want to sit her back into the housing, or the top of the housing. And the way this works is there's a cavity for the battery, and a cavity for the GPS unit, and like a sandwich, we want to make sure they're going to match one another. So solder in like so. Perfect. Now that was quite easy for me because this was using an old prototype, but to keep it watertight, your top housing will actually be a really tight fit. You might have issues with trying to fit it in so smoothly, but just take your time, be really careful. As long as them wires are safe, you shouldn't catch them, and we can always pull back out and check. Another key point here is the O-ring. Now, this is one of the few issues that propped up in the design. When we finally came to produce these collars, the fit seemed a bit too tight with regards to the top and the bottom with the housings that you have. So I've supplied O-rings and you have an option to use them, but if they are getting caught on the top housing and they're almost like rolling over the bottom of the housing, they're going to be no good. So you might be better off not using the O-rings at all, and if possible, getting some sealant and like some bathroom sealant, some just waterproofing sealant, any sort of silica sealant you can get, and just running it around the top. I understand that might not be possible, and it would just be an extra precaution. The actual housing itself will be pretty tight anyway. These aren't being glued in because we need to access them again. And if you do have the option of using silica sealant, just be careful of not filling these in, these holes where the bolts run through, because it can be a bit of a hassle when you have to reattach. Right, let's put this GPS unit back on top. That'll do for now. And then what you want to do, you want to get it in a perfect position ready for calibration. So we're actually going to attach these bottom bolts back on too as well. Although these will need to be taken off during the deployment phase. Just going to put them on quite loose. Whereas the top housing can go on as tight as you can make it. The general rule of thumb with tightening things is you get them as tight where it begins to resist, and then one final half turn. Okay. So, to summarise, we've glued in our bottom housing daily diary. It's been plugged in, logging successfully. That's going to be logging regardless. It will be data wasted, granted, from this time to the actual deployment, but that's okay. We've accounted for this the best we can, and we've agreed it's the best procedure for deployment. And the top housing is being plugged in, but it shouldn't be logging. It should not be logging because we switched it off with the magnet, because we're going to try and optimize the battery consumption for the GPS logger on top. And we're actually going to activate that in the deployment phase, but that will become more clear when you go over the video to do with that. At the moment, we have our VHF logging, but we want to stop that to optimize the battery. So you take the magnet, which was on before, and you use to switch on your GPS or check your GPS, pop it back where it was, and then you can even use the receiver to just double check the VHF isn't logging or emitting. Tape it back into place, and then you're ready for calibration.